Welcome, everyone. I'm Lynn Marsden Atlas, Executive Director at the Arthur Ross Gallery, and also the university's curator. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight, not only to see this beautiful exhibition at the Source, a Courbet landscape rediscovered, but also to have a wonderful lecture by Paul Galvez, Origins and Epistemes. Paul Galvez is an art historian, critic, and curator, and was most recently a research associate at the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas, Dallas, where he was also the director of the Masters of Art program in art history. He is currently co-curator of an exhibition that will be in 2025, entitled Impasto, with the Musée d'Orsay, the Musée du Louvre, and the Le Centre Pompidou in Paris. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that maybe next year, Paul. Paul is the author of Courbet's Landscapes, The Origins of Modern Painting, 2022, and his writings have appeared in Art Journal, October, Cahiers du Musée National de l'Art Moderne, and Texte, Kunst and Artforum. So without further ado, welcome, Paul.
This is working. Yes, it is. All right. Thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful, wonderfully gracious introduction. And I'd also like to thank Andre Novoski, the co-curator, and Emily Zimmerman for inviting me and helping me get to know this wonderful little exhibition. It's very rare that one works on a topic for as long as I have, and something comes out just when your book on the topic comes out that no one on the planet has seen in years. And on top of that, to have an exhibition around that work and to see it in a gallery with similar works is really quite a treat. So I'm very excited to have it here, especially because as you'll see as I talk, these are the kinds of works that really need to be seen in person. Reproduction, even the best kind of ink laser printing and magnification really cannot create the visceral physical experience of seeing the paint marks on the canvas. So for that reason, I hope that if anything, this lecture encourages those of you who are out there listening to come and see the show. Origins and Epistemes. Is that supposed to be there? Yeah. As I was preparing this lecture, I was trying to figure out a way not to repeat what I had just written in the book Courbet's Landscapes, The Origins of Modern Painting. And so what I wanted to do today is, in a way, underscore one of the points of that book, which is that Courbet, in the middle of the 19th century, through his landscape production, created an epistemological approach to representing the world, in which knowledge of the object, of the thing, of your object of study, is part of a process of uncovering its layers of meaning. And so in that spirit, I thought I would present today's talk as an unfolding of my own intellectual voyage to figure out the enigma of these landscapes. So my story really began in Germany several years ago, I won't say how many. when I saw these two works, one of which is in the show, so it's nice to see it again. And the work on the left, the bridge, was then in the Hamburg Kunsthalle, where it hung not too far away from one of the wonderful sources of the Lou River. And here you can already see some of the main commonalities with the pen painting, the mysterious center that seems to be leading somewhere but cannot be seen, but is nonetheless inviting you in. The accentuation of matter, both rock, water, and also foliage. And the way that the canvas is seemingly exploding with material. Now, when I first saw them, nothing in my own art historical training had prepared me for them, really, because Courbet, of course, is usually, well, back then was not taught as a landscapist primarily. But as I made my little tour down the Rhine to visit various museums, why is this not going forward? Oh, there we go. I noticed that in every little small museum, whether it was in Bremen, Essen, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, and eventually where I ended that tour in Zurich, there were one of these amazing landscapes. Now, seeing them all together back to back, in my mind, immediately created a corpus. And those of you who have not seen these works, I'm showing them here just so you can see the quality of them, not just the landlocked landscapes, but also the waves and seascapes. So with that little teaser, I decided that, well, the way to figure out how they came to the subject was to actually go to the sites, which was a perfectly obvious maneuver for anyone who studies landscape painting. With the idea, at least at the time, that seeing the places in situ might give me an idea of why they were so striking. So I made my way to the Franche-Comté, here in red, which is close to the Swiss border on the eastern side of France, and sought out landscapes like these. The work on the left is here in the show, on the back wall, and the right is a shaded stream known as the Puy Noir. Although the Puy Noir itself is actually a site next to it, but that is the area of the Brème River next to it. Many people who have written about the landscapes have remarked and that some of them were tourist sites, some of them, like the Puy Noir, were not really big tourist sites. Painter painted these, that many of them would be very accessible, but in fact, that was not the case. The other striking thing is how few of the landscapes of this period are actually of where Courbet lived and worked, which is Ornans on the Lou River, which is, in contrast, relatively airy for the area, filled with architecture, people, and roadways. The other thing that he seemed not to have painted, although he certainly could have, were the vast expanses on the plateaus. The Franche-Comté is made out of limestone, and water erosion has created all kinds of valleys and underground riverways. So on the top of those valleys are these plateaus where, if he wanted to, he could have painted a landscape that had just as much density as one of his seascapes, but he did not. The work on the left is actually by a local painter, Le Pointelin, who did paint those. So that was also a very interesting choice about what aspect of the local to paint. Not cities or villages, and not plateaus. in mapping out my trip, and I'm using the source of the Lison as one of the reference points here, I put into Google Maps the site of Ornon, which is the red dot up on the upper right. And if you put walking, it tells you to go down this way, down to this town of Salins, which is near the source of the Lison, which is right here. Now, if you're wondering why this route isn't more direct, it's because that if you look at the topographic map, all that area that the route avoids is actually high ground and would be very tiring if you had to traipse up the plateau and down again. So the route is suggested, which is more or less the same as that of the 19th century, is to walk in relatively low land through the valleys and downhill. Now, it is in one of these higher areas in the forest where there's this waterfall called the Bourg de Conche that Courbet painted in 1864, the same year as the source of the Lison River. And this is one of those landscapes. Oh, we have text up here. Hold on. How do we... You have to get out of it. Here.
Recording in progress.
This is one of those sites that is indeed very inaccessible. To get from the upper bridge area down to the bottom of the waterfall, you actually have to lower yourself down a rope that is barely existing as a step aid. In fact, I fell when I went down, and luckily it was snowing that day, as you'll see, and the snow-covered leaves broke my fall, because in the era of pre-cell phones, if I had broken my back, that would be the end of my career as an art historian. Now, what's interesting about this landscape, as many people who have studied it have noted, is that in the actual site, the water is further back than where it should be. And we have reports at the time where people talk about how Courbet made everything a little bit closer than what it was meant to be. So that immediately put to bed the hypothesis that these landscapes are so bodily present because he was actually depicting exactly what he saw. In fact, he accentuated the proximity in a variety of ways. One was moving all the landscape elements forward. Another was to have these viewpoints that you really couldn't access. So that, for instance, in the Bourg de Conche, to get roughly at the point of view where Courbet was, you actually have to stand in the river. So either he put his easel on some rocks in the middle, or he, in his own painterly manner, moved the point of view. And I'm just showing you on the right what is behind you when you turn around from that point of view. So you're really right in the middle of the river. Sometimes he would add staffage figures, which had nothing to do really with the scene. I'm just showing you here in the Yale painting how this figure on horseback or donkey back is something that he was doing already the year before in the Saintonge, and he just repeated that with the Yale painting. Here's another case, a painting that's become more well-known because it's really the most explicitly geological painting of in the Courbet landscape, of where he moved what is called the Roche Pourrie really, really close to the viewer. And if you once again try to get to that site, as I did, the mountain can only be that far away if you want it framed the way he had it. And finally, as has been well pointed out in the catalog and elsewhere, he eliminated a lot of the industrial or proto-industrial buildings that were around the various sources and caverns that he painted, all the more to immerse the viewer directly with no mediation next or in front of the site. And these are the buildings around the source of the Lou River, which is on the other side of Ornans from the source of the Lison. So the other thing the art historian does, of course, when trying to figure out the motivations for a particular subject is to check the textual and critical response. But because many of these paintings were not shown in Paris, or if they were shown there or anywhere, there wasn't much written about them, there's very little to go on in terms of direct feedback to them. And as I was looking at who Courbet was corresponding with at the time, many avenues, either via friends or through Courbet directly, led to his old friend Max Bouchon, who had been exiled in Switzerland, but had come back in the amnesty in the 1850s and was now writing, but he was not allowed to write direct political tracts. So he wrote books about poetry, or his own poetry, but also about patois song, and even a guidebook to the area around Salins, his hometown, which is the town, largest town closest to the source of the Lison. Now, none of these literary and linguistic texts talk about landscape explicitly. And so at the time, I thought it was an interesting side subject, but not really directly relevant to the landscapes. The guidebook, however, provided me with an unexpected key. Because in that text, or rather, it's buried in the popular songbook, but it's related, the theme is more or less repeated in the guidebook. He explicitly connects linguistic research with geological research. And what he says is that a man picks up a pebble, turns it over, and then, finding it worthless, shrugs his shoulders and tosses it back. Later on, he finds another, and while looking at it, compares it to the first, noting the similarities and differences. Little by little, he comes to suspect deposits more or less regular, spanning entire, that should be eras. Then come theories of alluvial sedimentation, of upheavals, and so forth, until eventually the science of the geology is born. So Bouchon, and I would argue by extension Courbet and all their friends who were in Salins at that moment, seeing each other every day, thought about their projects as uncovering a deep history, one that wasn't directly obvious, but through research and comparison and comparative study would reveal knowledge that had been lost to history. I will speed through this part, but this is just to show that this interest in popular song as the reservoir of local knowledge, oftentimes not in French, but in the local dialect or patois, was something that was being rapidly excavated by all kinds of researchers and amateur scholars and critics like Champfleury from the 1850s onward, as it became a national project at that time. And they even would transcribe music so that it could be recorded. And just to give you an example of why they would do this, at least in Bouchon's case, there was a very much an independent streak in the Franche-Comté where they wanted to identify themselves with the Gauls rather than with the Romans, because Caesar had defeated the Gauls in the Gallic Wars. And since Napoleon III liked to see himself as a modern day Caesar, there was a kind of political excitement to identify a non-Roman past. And so they would try to find words that, like talben, that seem to have been carried over into patois and thus survived the deceltification of the area by more or less hiding underground in local language and customs. The bottom set of words is actually, it is Latin, but it's a term that got turned into a child song in Ornans, and Bouchon wrote about that. And clearly he must have heard that from Courbet, who was from Ornans. All right. Now, all this sounds like Bouchon's hobby. And even though he had high-minded reasons for doing it, how did it connect to landscape in a very real and practical way? Well, just at the moment that Courbet, Bouchon, and as we'll see, their friend, the geologist Jules Marcoux, were thinking about the landscape as a sort of fountain of information that needed to be excavated. There was a debate at the time about where that battle where Julius Caesar actually defeated Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain. And by this time in the 19th century, the site got reduced to either a town in Burgundy called Alise or a town in the Franche-Comté called Alès. And there were very vigorous debates about this, and Napoleon III actually commissioned excavations to figure out which one it was, because he was, in fact, writing a history of the life of Julius Caesar, obviously setting him up as a kind of predecessor for his own greatness. And while the whole history about it is actually quite fascinating, what I want to point out here is that the role of language and landscape was fundamental. Landscape, obviously, because they actually had to find where the site was. And the usual way of doing that was to read, for instance, Caesar's reports of the wars and actually match it to sites in the landscape. So this is a map of the French carte d'état-major, the kind of official map of the country. And it has been reproduced in a military magazine where they circled where they thought the Roman blockade was around the town of Alès, which they thought was Alesia, where the last battle occurred. And you'll notice that it is right next to the source of the Lison River, and the Gour de Conches actually is directly in one of those rings, because one of the antiquarian friends of Bouchon and Courbet actually argued that the Gour de Conches was one of the sources of water that they used to fill moats to protect the encampment. So how were they going to prove, in addition to mapping the topography, that Alès was Alesia? Well, that's just Gour de Conches. Well, the answer was to do linguistic research. And one of the interesting facets about this interest in the deep historical knowledge embedded in things is that it only would take a pebble or sometimes a letter to reveal what really happened. And so this is within classical studies, this is actually a very well-known inscription, because it's one of the first attested, or one of the earliest attested inscriptions that has the Celtic language in Latin. And long story short, that A-L-I-S-I-I-A, that vowel I, it could either be derived to a short E or a long E. And if it was a short E, that meant it was probably Alise. And if it was a long E, it was probably Alès. And so this was really important for them, because that one letter would tell you whether it was Alesia or whether Alès was Alesia or Alise was Alesia. And this whole debate about letters actually has a whole funny component about it, where they would joke about the difference between Alès and Alise. And if I had more time, I would explain the joke. But let's just say that I don't want to say pedantic nature of it, but the kind of highly nerdy focus on it was not lost on the people at the time. Petra Chu has written a catalog about the geological side of this because Jules Marcoux, who was a geologist who was trained in Paris, taught at Harvard, and then raised his children when he retired back in Salins, was also someone who was interested in the geological temporality of the landscape, and in fact mapped the entire Jurassic system, including the Franche-Comté, in one of the earliest geological world maps of the time. And this painting, which I showed you earlier, is actually a portrait of Marcoux, who is that figure down here in the bottom, although really it's more of a portrait of the rock formation than of Marcoux himself. Okay. And now, is there any way we can get rid of that top thing? Can we make that a side thing? Okay. So in thinking about the relationship between this sense of deep time, natural history, language, I began reading Michel Foucault's Order of Things, an archaeology of the human sciences. And this is a text I had read in a former life as a student of the history of science. And it was important in that field because it is a text that really wanted to look at the history of philosophy, not from the point of view of how concepts were passed from one great philosopher to another, but how the entire structural organization of how one thought changed over time. And in the 19th century for Foucault, that happened more in the human sciences, in natural history, in the study of language, in the study of labor, rather than in the great, philosophical tradition from Kant to Nietzsche, let's say. And for him, what was important in this, what he calls this epistemic shift, is that unlike in the 18th century and before, where more or less knowledge was divided into categories and tables, basically like a Linnaean taxonomy of objects, whether it be words or animals. They weren't really concerned with historical development. But in the 19th century, when you have this explosion of stuff to archive and go through, the historical development of all those things and their connections over time and the gaps in knowledge and what Foucault would call the space of non-knowledge, what you don't know, but is nonetheless there if you were willing to put all the connections together to basically sift through all the layers of meaning. That was what, for Foucault, characterized the 19th century episteme. And I pulled this quote, which I think very vividly describes it, but as I'm reading it, I'm going to suggest to you that you think about one of Courbet's landscapes while I'm reading it. So Foucault says, what matters is no longer identities, distinctive characters, permanent tables with all their possible paths and routes, but great hidden forces developed on the basis of a primitive and inaccessible nucleus, origin, and history. From now on, things will be represented only from the depths of a density withdrawn into itself, perhaps blurred and darkened by obscurity, but bound tightly, inescapably grouped by a vigor that is hidden down below in those depths. Visible forms, their connections, the blank spaces that isolate them and surround their outlines, all these will now be presented to our gaze only in an already composed state, already articulated in that nether darkness that is fomenting over time. When I read this, not only did I think it was a very beautiful evocation of this paradigm shift in knowledge that he was trying to identify, but it was very uncannily like what it's like to look at a Courbet landscape, where there are indeed depths that are in the darkness and that things are no longer easily visible through paths and routes and characters, and that there seems to be something hidden there in the obscurity if you try to excavate it, which is why he called it an archaeology of the human sciences. And these are the kinds of works that I had in mind when I was reading them. Now, it would take a lot longer, and here I'll just pitch my book if you want to know more about why deep time was so important in this milieu. But I will conclude now, because I think we're running close to time, with something that actually surprised me also about the Foucault, beyond the theoretical aperçu it gave me into Courbet's landscapes. And that is that it actually provided, in an unexpected way, a direct historical reference or a set of historical references in which to frame Courbet and his friends' research. Because the examples that Foucault gives of the 19th century episteme, at least in the natural history and linguistics, are two men, Georges Cuvier, who is the head of the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, and Franz Bopp, who was the great comparative linguist who basically synthesized Sanskrit into the family of Indo-European languages, which is still how we think about that language family today. Now, one might think, oh, well, that's really neither here nor there because Cuvier lived way before Courbet and there's no connection. But in fact, Cuvier worked on geological stratigraphy with a man named Alexandre Brongniart. And Brongniart, so that's the map they did on the left. And the Bopp on the right was translated into French in the 1860s. Brongniart actually was Marcou's teacher. So we actually have a direct connection between Cuvier via Brongniart to Marcou. And so this idea of layers of Earth actually having a sense of geohistorical development, and rather than them just being deposited there by some divine power, as they used to think in the 18th century, that was something that Foucault identified that actually historically is directly relevant to the Courbet milieu. And that's the landscape that has the stratigraphy that's most obvious. And Marcou, when he wrote about this rock, actually said that he saw a drawing of this rock in Brongniart's library before he died. As for the linguistics, many of the scholars that Bouchon and others read were very influenced by the ideas of Bopp. And as I said, it was translated just at this time into French by the person, Michel Brial, who held the first chair of comparative linguistics at the Collège de France. So it's in the air as well. So to conclude this little voyage through my own research, what I hope you perhaps gathered is that in many ways, the task of the art historian is not unlike what Bouchon, Marcou, and Courbet are doing, in that they are taking something that seems an image, an object, a landscape that may seem static, unremarkable at first glance, but once you begin to actually delve into what went into the making of it, you find all these various pathways. And that sometimes these pathways are not texts that just give you a straightforward description or explain or interpret the painting, but provide a structural or a epistemological parallel that shows the shared mentality of the group. And I will just conclude here by saying that it's something that happens uniquely at this moment, I think, in Courbet's career, because he's, one, reawakened to paint landscapes, two, because he's with this particular group of people in 1864, because he doesn't do these grottos anytime else, really. And three, and this you'll have to read my catalog essay, there was a political crisis in the town of Salins at that moment that made this interest in the deep history of the landscape a very relevant antidote to nascent bourgeois tourism that was invading the town of Salins at the time. And I'll end it there. Thank you. So I think there's time for questions.
Paul, is this on? Paul, thank you.
It is.
I have the first question that comes to mind for me is about Bouchon, Max Bouchon. This is a name that I recognize, I think, from the history of 19th century, from 19th century French art history. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are probably some larger connections that you can maybe point us towards in terms of this relationship between Courbet and Bouchon and others in their circle. And I was wondering if doing that might help me see how your particular story fits into larger patterns in the big story of 19th century French art.
Sure. Thanks, Matthew, for that question. To repeat for the online audience, the question was about Courbet's relationship with Max Bouchon and how his relationship with Courbet at the time fits into both his relationship with Bouchon previously and also just in general in the historiography of 19th century painting. So those of you who've studied Courbet know that Bouchon was one of Courbet's political allies during the Second Republic. And for instance, T.J. Clark writes at length about how Bouchon's writing in the local press was one of the most perceptive presentations of the Beurre Ornand when it was shown in the Franche-Comté. So since their childhood, they had this bond, which was only broken because Bouchon went into exile. Now, when Bouchon came back, he was not allowed on the conditions of his amnesty to do direct political writing. But he began to write in the in the local newspaper where the politics was thinly veiled. And soon afterwards actually started advocating for opposition candidates to the mayor of Salins at the time, who he had a falling out with. So the way I see it is that one of Courbet's reasons for going to Salins for 3 months, he didn't just go there for a day trip. He was in Salins for 3 months with all these guys. I think the spiciness of political life there and cultural life drew him in. And Bouchon's writing for the newspaper, he wasn't the editor, but he might as well have been. If you look through Le Salinois, he or his friends writes, basically every other page on everything from cemetery hours to rules for hanging posters to noise pollution. They're very, very active. And I think that drew Courbet there. And Petrichou argues that he painted the source of Liaison on the way there, which he probably did. One could speculate that he probably went back a couple of times to paint it as well. And I forgot to mention that Bouchon owned a copy of the source of Liaison that Courbet asked for when Bouchon passed away in '69. So that's the part about Bouchon's personal connection with Courbet. In terms of the broader picture, when we think about Courbet in the 1860s, the intellectual figure that we normally associate with him at this time is the anarchist philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who dies in 1865. And Courbet and Proudhon have a very vigorous and very generative correspondence that's often cited, where Courbet comes closest to giving a manifesto of what he means by realism. what interested me about Bouchon is this whole aspect that had not been studied, even though Bouchon and Courbet were just as engaged as Proudhon and Courbet, actually even more so at the time. But it's not laid out in such an obvious way as it is with the direct discussion between Proudhon and Courbet in his letters. But once you get into the milieu and filter through all the writings, you actually see that they actually wrote more in each other's orbit, or rather painted or wrote more. So yeah, I think it's just another episode in that relationship that is unexplored or underexplored, as well as giving a different reading of his interest in landscape at that time that's not necessarily about a Proudhonian return to small town village life. I mean, there's that aspect of it, but it's in a much more complicated dialogue with modernization and what I'm calling an epistemological shift, a la Foucault.
Hi, is this on? Yeah. Oh, thank you, Paul, for that talk, and thanks so much for sharing that alarming story about you falling down. That's intense.
Yeah,
and then I'm so glad that you weren't injured, but it made me think about these images differently, not as necessarily images of beauty, but images of peril. And I just had two questions. Could you maybe talk a little bit about Courbet's let's say the risk, the physical risk of travel to Courbet, but also this idea of, is getting to the episteme hazardous or dangerous at this time, insofar as either in terms of geological work, or in fact of getting at a local language that is being suppressed by a particular government. So again, this the general question of the hazards of the episteme, and we're also glad that you're healthy.
All right, thanks, David. So the question was about, in terms of the experience of these landscapes physically, in addition to the pleasure or the phenomenological excitement of it, was there a sense of danger, peril, physical risk? Might want to say the sublime. I don't know if you'd go there, but anyway, danger. In terms of my little anecdote about falling down, that is very much a 21st century response to someone who's used to being connected to the world everywhere. I don't think it would have been so alarming for a 19th century Franc-Comtois to be walking through the landscape. And even if they hurt themselves, which probably happened quite a bit, I think someone would know where they went, and someone sooner or later would come by if they were missed. In other words, I didn't see anything in the historical record that made people worried to go to these places. If they went there at all, it was either to follow the recommendations of guidebooks, both the high end, like the Voyage Picturesque over here, but also Bouchon's, which was much cheaper and really easygoing. It was almost jocular in tone. But from a subjective point of view, I think you're right to point out that there is something very creepy and uncannily organic about these landscapes. And you do experience that in front of them when it's not the huge waterfalls of the source of the Lou, which is that's more sublime. When you get into these very slow brooding where nothing seems to be happening, but it's dark and you're alone, then you feel like you've been transported to another world, and not necessarily one where you feel safe because there's no other human presence around. And even in the 19th century, that would have been a disturbing thing, because it's a kind of removed from the normal time of daily country life, if I can put it that way.
Oh, thank you so much. Fantastic. I I think I have a question that's a bit more broadly about what happens when landscape painting with somewhat of a plein air bend cozies up with geology and deep history. And a couple of questions sort of that follow from that. Right? A, would you say that that is one of the ways in which plein air painting can pretend it is a form of history painting then, right? Because it allows that kind of historic knowledge into itself. And B, what to do with those aspects of a picture like this that are kind of not about geology, but actually providing what plein air painting actually provides best, a momentary experience, a time of day, a season, foliage that's just springing out, water that's coming towards you. So I guess my second question then is what to do with those aspects of this picture, right? Is that the moment where that deep history becomes present, right? So that we are assured as viewers that the deep history affects us, right? Affects us in the way we are in the landscape. Is that the combination here, or do you think that those moments, you know, which I love in this picture, right? The kind of foliage on the left and at the front, and I presume that the liaison is this is spring maybe, right? Because this waterfall looks pretty plentiful, right? So there must be snow runoff and so on. But all that information, right? That seems to me a way to also transcend that deep history and just present it very profoundly. So just any response you have to those thoughts that are going through my head right now would be appreciated.
All right, so Andre's question was about the status of the temporality of these landscapes vis-a-vis plein air painting, or how we've come to know plein air painting. I mean, certainly, just to start off, they both were and were not plein air, like many landscapes of the 19th century. We have documented accounts of people seeing Courbet paint these, and while they may have exaggerated how quickly he did them, I don't think they exaggerated that much. I mean, they say 2 hours, but by this point, Courbet could actually do a landscape relatively quickly if he wanted to. Maybe not a great one, but inevitably he probably worked on them in the studio as well, and he probably even did some things in the studio without having to go to the site. So they are neither completely neither completely plein air nor completely studio. They're a sort of mix of the two in his practice. Getting to the experience of it in terms of how you situate oneself in regards to the passing of time. I would argue that the slowness of these landscapes, which probably Michael Fried of all art historians has been the best about describing, is different from the momentary that you would see in like Monet. I mean, you could say that better than me, but for me, these landscapes are not about the instant or the moment captured. I think they're about initiating the viewer into a different mode that requires them to observe for a long time and slowly to fully appreciate everything that's being offered to them, both visually and even corporeally. And one could say that the unique way that Courbet paints, where even at a very close range, the pictorial material is almost co-substantial with the natural material depicted in the painting. That unique way of painting is what allows this temporal expansion without you either getting bored or feeling that you got the image. There's always some darkness and some form that seems to be arriving to perception. And the way I put it is that he manages to put the interest in detail that still life painters were good at capturing with the materials of objects, but do it all over the pictorial field the way a landscape painter would treat a scene or a view. So just to, give this very tentative answer to your question, to me, they seem different modes, temporal modes. And then to add that, the whole color aspect, which is another thing. I mean, there's color contrast and brightness is not at work here. Sure, I mean, you have certain greens that are more saturated, but capturing the effects of the brightest light, or let's say optical sensations, is not really Courbet's concern, as it might have been interpreted for certain plein air painters.
Thank you so much for this, Paul. This is really great to hear. I wanted to ask you about Courbet's occasional uses of figures in the landscape or scale, and maybe whether you see any sort of epistemic dissonance in them. Like the Great Bridge is kind of a perfect example of that. It's got that rider figure that, and sometimes when I look at this painting, I have to remind myself that it's a Courbet almost. The Foucault passage that you pulled was sort of perfect epistemically to describe the source of the liaison. It's like structured around not knowing, it's structured around absence and darkness. But pictures like these also that Courbet is making, they're sort of like epistemically classical, like not to mention art historically classical. You get to know the landscape through scale and through characters. So I wanted to ask you what you think broadly about maybe these two epistemic modes coexisting in Courbet's landscape practice, and how we're supposed to sort of bounce them off of each other.
Thanks, Jalen. It's a great question, actually. The question was about the role of the figures and how they do or do not fit into the reading of the landscape as a kind of epistemological model. Could you actually talk further about what you were saying and why sometimes when you look at them, you don't think that you're looking at a Courbet landscape? Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, I guess maybe I've been working on source of the liaison pictures for too long in association with this this exhibition, but I feel like there's so much recession into nothingness that happens in those pictures. Whereas when I look at this one, actually, it's like, there is darkness that the picture centers around, but you're given levels to it, and you're given ultimately some sort of anchor figuratively to keep you grounded. So.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, there's some sky, there's a pathway, there's a person moving, and there's architecture. So all those things are the classical ways that a landscapist organized pictorial space to have the viewer imagine that they're wandering somehow through that landscape. And there you have definitely more than you do in, let's say, the source of the liaison or the Puits Noir. Courbet was a painter of his time, and he did not escape all the time the conventions, but he tended to reduce them. So here that there is a figure, but when you see it, you really look at that waterfall and the bridge more than really the figure. And in the Gour de Conche, I mean, sometimes people don't notice that there are what are probably kind of picturesque lovers' rendezvous on the bridge up above. Did he put them in for the market so they would sell better? Did the client get too disturbed by not having any figurative content and ask for them to be put in? Because Courbet was certainly not above doing that on request. It's an open question. But obviously my bias is towards the Courbets that not only don't have figures, but are very corporeal or bodily in their composition. To the point where, for me at least, it's not even a question of a female body part, but just an orifice or a cleavage of tissue or some sort of differentiated mass. I mean, for me, there's a kind of radical dehumanification of bodily shape in these landscapes that pushes them further and further away with identification with any kind of body. And what I called in the book is a corporeality in the absence of any body. That's what I think is very unique about them. And really only Cézanne and Pissarro at certain moments gets close. I mean, Cézanne gets close and goes beyond, but they're really unique in that way, I think.
Thanks for this talk and this fascinating discussion. You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the book by Leslie Geddes on Leonardo and deep time, where she argues that Leonardo is observing water over rock and is aware of two things at the same time. One is that he can't still the water to paint it, so he has to sort of imagine its arrested motion, but also that he is aware that the water is the cause of the erosion of rock, that water is responsible for changing the surface of rock. And yet these geological observations, these acknowledgements of geological time, of the changes that the artist's lifespan is too short, you know, no matter how long he lives, to observe in real time, you know, is all put in the service of staging religious stories that point to a kind of eternal time, right? Like the Virgin and Child are in these landscapes. And so I think I'm wondering whether, you know, in your interest in aligning an emergence of geological thought with an interest in political history, where you think Courbet is in a kind of quest for origin. I mean, in the end, does the geology predate any kind of national history, or is it there to affirm it?
Mm. So the question via Leonardo was Courbet's understanding of geology vis-a-vis politics and social life. Is that and history? Yeah. This actually relates in an interesting way with the question about the figure, because one place where the linguistic and the geological models diverge is precisely at the question of the historical, because you can trace the history of a language only to when people spoke, but not before. Whereas with geological history, you can go to the beginning of the planet if you can find the traces of it. And I think one of the reasons why Courbet's paintings have had a longer afterlife than Bouchon's attempts to write popular literature using patois-derived words is that he understood the tension between the kind of physical presence of the landscape or the landscape painting in the here and now, and this idea that, but it could have been like this before history even happened, before there was history. It's a not just prehistoric, but kind of almost ahistoric, anti-historic image of the world. Whereas language is still always bound to human sentience and communication. And so it doesn't have the same ability to go past our normal parameters of what historical time is. That's how I would answer that. I mean, it's a complicated question. And Leonardo, of course, is really, really interesting, especially in his notebooks about what he says about images and geology and nature. But so I'm not surprised, actually, that he's the person who kind of raised this question.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really great and got me all thinking about all kinds of things. I want to actually come back to your beginning in Germany, because I wonder whether that's all so by happenstance, because I want to push a little bit more on that history thing. And I would actually contest that that period would look at geology as ahistorical. I would argue actually that it is that level of like digging down becomes this idea of a history that is a different history, but very much historical.
Mm.
And I do wonder, what are the sort of connections to Germany? Because I don't think it's by chance that he later becomes good friends with Leibel, because you have a similar digging down, and also the parallel between formation of painting and formation of nature. There's a parallel. But there's a long tradition by then from the German Romanticism about geognosis and the idea that these levels of history are embedded in the earth, but they're also kind of part of the reflection on humanity's history. So it's very different to language, but there is this strong dimension. And when André said this about presentification, I think it's not at all this impressionist idea of the moment, but more the idea of, in the moment of the experience, that history, which is you can't access because it's gone, even though they're the rocks, you kind of insert yourself. And the literary moment I want to quote here is one of my favorite scenes in Eichendorff's Ahnung und Gegenwart, which translated would be presentiment and presence, which is post-Napoleonic and one of the first real romantic novels set in the contemporary era. And he says, the hero jumps into the river, and by jumping into the river, he jumps into history. So this idea that the contact with nature is allowing him to sort of, I like the cleavage of time, like to sort of insert his body into that history. And I do wonder whether some of this is actually going on here, and is there any connection to this before he actually goes to Germany?
Oh, great. Those are great questions. So there were two questions. One was about Courbet's German connections. And indeed, it is not a coincidence that all these Courbets were in Germany. And the second one is about a question about whether geological time is anti-historical or whether it's actually just it's still historical, but in a different way. So I'll answer the German one first, because that's the easier question. Courbet had many collectors in Germany. He went to Frankfurt and then Munich, and that's the Liebel Schule comes out of that. And if you go to the Pinakothek in Munich, you'll see all these 19th century, Schuhe, Karl Schuhe, and there's others. And you meet, as soon as you see these landscapes, they looked at Courbet and they probably painted in his orbit, because they're technically so close, even if the subject matter is different. As a result, in the early 20th century, many of the early curators at these museums, the first Courbets they bought were these landscapes. And they tended to buy the best ones, because for all kinds of reasons, France, the government and the Luxembourg had many of the spectacular salon ones, but these smaller scale ones, not so much. Now, in terms of the question of geological time, you're right in that geology as a metaphor for the passing of time and how that changes our sense of where we are in the world is a big 19th century obsession. Foucault actually doesn't use it as an example of the 19th century episteme, but all his language is geological in nature. I mean, that was what was so striking about that quote. So indeed, these metaphors were applied to human events. But just to give a counterexample, well, before I do that, obviously as a 21st century person, it's easy for me to look back and say, and make an easy split between language only deals with human history and geology deals with non-human history. Of course, there's going to be moments of overlap. The historian Jules Michelet, who I think in sensibility is very close to Courbet's attitude towards the materiality of nature, in all his histories, no matter when and where they take place, or whether it's about animals or saints, there's a big emphasis on substances. especially oily and creamy ones. And that's why reading his history is a very pleasurable experience, because you see all these metaphors and words that are just mellifluous when you read them. There would be an example of where substance almost has a kind of different place in his world than the events of human history, like kings and witches and animals, and the sea. It's ubiquitous. It's always there. It doesn't seem to ever go away, and it changes, but it just changes form. It doesn't actually change in a direction, in an irreversible direction. So in that sense, while not exactly ahistorical, it's not moving or according to the rules of human time. All this is to say that there's different models of temporality, and I think that, Andre, you can speak to this more than me, but the interesting thing about this moment in the 19th century is how multiple models coexist and intertwine. And your question about plein air painting, I think, is an example of that. But it happens in literature as well, of course. Okay. All right. I'm getting the signal to end. So if there's no more questions, thank you.